Everybody, welcome to episode 171, the final episode of the year. So, in this episode, we're going to recap some of the biggest lessons that we've taken from this year's Fight Chat Fridays, and we're going to bring them into one nice episode to give you some takeaways for the end of this year, coming into next year for your ITF Taekwon-Do Sparring.
Yeah, and maybe most of these have a particular episode that we're referring people back to, and so if something jumps out at you, you can quickly go back, find that episode, and watch the thing in full. But our very first point, you must pull the trigger. This is just something that shouts through all of 2023. What are we talking about? Yeah, it's the don't wait, create, don't hesitate. You've got to be the one that is leading the dance and initiating the action. First in, first out, or first in, last out, however we decide that phrase goes, is the way we want to be. So above all else in your Taekwondo, be proactive over the coming year, I suppose.
Yeah, you have to pull that trigger, even though sometimes you know what the right thing to do is. Sometimes it's that psychology inside, that little bit of fear maybe that's holding you back. So you have to pull the trigger if you want to get scores on the board. It's about hitting and not getting hit. And if you don't pull the trigger, you're never going to hit.
Next one, Richie.
All right, so it's a slightly, potentially, who knows, maybe situation of a return for the back leg dolio. We've seen it come through in Copa World Cup, and we see it again in the World Cup and Euros this year. So this back leg turning kick is making a return because of people's stances as well, adjusting slightly away from that side-facing stance. The half-facing stance allows that turning kick to come in a little bit more like this back leg here. And if you get it in, you can bury that in, and it's a nice low shot as well, which also gives you a little bit of a bonus mark to make sure that you get it in there, because the judges aren't meant to score if they hear it, but of course it does always just kind of tick that box a little bit more.
Yeah, our next one, again, kind of comes from our stats a little bit, where we have this idea of the restarts almost as a set piece. You know it's going to happen. Oh, it could be something in the order of 12 to 14 times in a match. So you've the start of the first and second round, and you have every time there's a warning or a foul given. And these restarts give you an opportunity to think what's important next and to take action, creating a little pressure on your opponent. So, if nothing else, definitely create a plan for yourself for the restart, and just before the referee lifts the hand, you should really know what you're going to do. Take the initiative and go with that.
Purposeful carries is next. We did see a big difference in this in the female and the male version of the game. Magomed is two-time world champion now after this year's world championships, and we found that his side kick was very much a purposeful attempt and good intent behind it, not just carrying his front leg without any intention. He's using it to really bang that side kick in. So some people, they just lift that leg and they don't really do much with it, and sometimes this can actually put you in a worse position because you can be punished for it.
So another theme that we came across over the course of the year was this idea that, punchers cannot be outworked. And in fact, we're looking to see that they must outwork their opponent, possibly by 3-1. And like, we're going back to this episode where we had, again, European Championship, Luke Moriarty and Ahmed Ramadan, where what we were seeing in this one is, the work rate and the intensity from Ahmed just not being quite enough to carry him ahead of Luke in this instance. But it's a really, really good example as you looked at that fight of just how hard you do have to work, because the person who's relying on those kicks, particularly head scores for their scoring, only need to be lucky once, if you want to call it lucky. They only need to be on point once or twice to have a huge return on the scoreboard. So if you're relying on those punches, you need to get to work, create lots of scoring opportunities, and if possible, maximize those scores.
Next, we have outwork equals each outscore. So we've seen, particularly in episode 157, but also we've seen this throughout the year here in all our episodes, that if you have that higher work rate, we see because of the stats as well that we've started, that you are in a good position. So you have to be able to outwork your opponent as step number one. Your work rate must be high, and it goes back to the last lesson we just had as well. And in this one, it was very evident that the difference here is going to be the numbers. If you're attempting more shots, more opportunity for you to make contact, which means there's more opportunity for you to get on that scoreboard. So it's very, very important you have a really high work rate, and if you can dominate your opponent on that particular facet, you're going to be in a good position for the overall result of the match.
Our next one's quite an interesting one, and this was episode 150, and we were looking at a comparison of different techniques that have been successful in the past in ITF and kind of their modern adaptations. And one of the things that we found is that for someone who has a good axe or hacks kick, very much as it was back in the 80s and 90s, it's really, really difficult to counter or stop that, or certainly if we look at the people who do it and do it well, they scored it very consistently, match after match, competition after competition. And our point out of that was, look, there's something to this. If this is a high percentage score shot and is effective for certain people a high proportion of the time, really kind of should look into it. It's definitely something to put into your training for the next year.
Next, we have this whole idea of lefty dominance. So we come up with a little bit of a theory here that left leg fighters have a slight advantage. For this one, this is also the idea of left leg fighters usually come up against right-legged people coming through the ranks, and then they're just a little bit used to fighting that opposite style, whereas almost the inverse for anybody that has the right leg style. They're usually coming up also against right leg fighters. So when the lefties come on the scene in international level, is there a particular advantage for them? Who knows? But it's something that we kind of have come up with as a little bit of a theory, no real substance behind it as such. But lefties particularly have a little bit of an advantage. We're not saying you need to change your stance or swap your style completely, but we do notice that a lot of successful fighters do have a little bit of a tendency to lean off that left leg leading stance. Not all of them, but it is a little bit of a trend.
So one that we are very, very clear on is the idea that you want to keep your warnings down, ideally 5 or less, and that gives you the opportunity to have a couple of warnings left for round 2, which becomes very, very important from time to time. And we have some examples of this in the individual male sparring 57 kilos at the World Championships in Finland. And you can see the impact of the warnings as the match goes on. But consistently, as we look at the stats now of match after match after match, those people who are going towards 6 and more warnings tend to find themselves under pressure, particularly at the end of round 2, and not being able to take a low risk approach to close out the fight, but instead having to keep going, having to push on, and the match being in the balance right till the very, very end. So if you'd like to have a lower stress finish to your matches, try to keep your number of warnings lower, and in particular try and keep 2 warnings in the bag for the end of the second round.
Hip and hands. This is one of the ones that is like a strategy that has been there for time on time in terms of the successful fighters we've seen. In this episode, and particularly in 148, we had a look at Ziga and how he compared to his instructor Thomas Barada in the 63 division from terms of the stats. But we see that the hip and hands strategy is still one of the most dominant in ITF. We see that if you can get that front leg to the hip and then have a good success of getting that into hands as well, that you're going to be in a really, really good position against any style, any fighter. It's just one of these tried and tested routes to success. It seems that if you can really dominate that, and of course it also goes into things like timing, your distance control, but if you can really, really get to grips with this little strategy, it's going to set you up for everything else in a real positive way.
So next we're looking at episode 160. So we're saying don't counter an unorthodox fighter, and in this one we were looking at Ergashev from Uzbekistan and Doyle Duran representing Spain. And Ergashev, quite an unorthodox style, a lot of spins, a lot of 360s, a lot of skips and changes of leg. So really dynamic stuff, but it does make leading them into a counter a little bit more challenging, as he's throwing shots that are not necessarily the ones that are expected, or the ones that you're leaving yourself open for. So normally when it comes to how we advise coaching a counter fighter or being a counter fighter, we would say you want to have the initiative still. You want to be leading the other person and offering the opening that they're going to take. But if the other person is taking very unorthodox responses to the openings that you're creating, go back, be simpler, and take it onto the front foot, and be, in that case, you want to match them on the front foot and be more of an attacking fighter.
The next one is from episode 168, one of our recent episodes. You have to decide what you're going to do before the last mat. If you're on the last route of squares around the whole tatami, you're going to be in trouble by the time the person comes forward and puts you under pressure, because you don't have that luxury of a little bit of space behind you. If you do, you're going to step out and give away a lot of warnings. So we can see the people who avoid giving away a lot of exits actually decide where they're going to go and how they're going to move before that last mat. Whereas if you're deciding a little bit too late, there's a chance that you're going to give away a lot of exits in terms of the warning count, and that's not going to be good for your overall score, as we've seen from one of the earlier lessons of not conceding too many warnings.
So for our next one, we're going to talk about the idea of going back to the well. If something is working, go back and do some more of it. And in this case, episode 146, we had a look at Arthur Kuzmin against Jacob Gajawa, and we can see that keeping that shorter distance, either through the blitz or the direct counter with hands, was being effective for him against Jacob, who otherwise was doing a pretty good job in terms of controlling the distance and making this a match about his use of the front leg. But once you found something that is working, make that a problem for your opponent to solve. Don't let them off the hook. Make them keep having to solve that problem until they do, and then it's time to change. So as a simple strategy or a simple reminder for your fighters, yeah, if it's working, keep doing it.
So here we have contact rate rules everything, episode 139. So we've seen this fight between Daniel and Ziga in the 63 final of the Euros this year. We see that the contact rate is so important. It's not just about working hard and just throwing shots aimlessly. You got to make contact with the shots, and then that's where you have to continue to maximize the scores once you get into contact rate. So once you get into that range, are you going to just throw one and move? Ideally, you want to maximize each opportunity and each exchange you have, which goes back to our idea again of being first into contact and last out. That's ideally what you want to do to maximize your impacts on the scoreboard with a very high contact rate.
Our last one is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, the idea of a distracting back fist, and if you don't know where this comes from,
back fist, number one side,
maybe watch this one.
and spin press and kick. There we go. Keep your eyes on wrist, and don't forget the distracting back fist.
So don't know how well you can hear that, but it comes from the film Foot Fist Way.
Spin press and kick.
Definitely worth a watch if you've been around Taekwondo for a very long time. We watched this in the summer camp, the ITA Irish summer camp this summer, and a few people got a great kick out of that. And shout out to Master Jones there as well. But we can see, straight away, sometimes these things, as old a strategy as they are, can be very effective. Threatening high to bring the hands out of position and adding a shot. One example of it there, but and we've seen a few more. But it can definitely be something that we can use or play with, and maybe a reminder to be playful and to try unorthodox things or things that you haven't seen in action, just as something that you can use to add to your repertoire.